All right. Okay, welcome everyone to Taller Puertorriqueño, the Corazón Cultural del Barrio. My name is Lisa Moser and I'm the gift shop manager. And I want to thank you for joining us today for this Meet the Author on Zoom event. Okay, welcome everyone to Taller Puertorriqueño, the Corazón Cultural del Barrio. My name is Lisa Moser and I'm the gift shop. Okay, sorry about there was a lag on the YouTube stream. Okay. Okay, yes. Thank you for joining us for this Meet the Author on Zoom event. Just a few things about Zoom. We ask that you keep your mic muted throughout the duration of the event. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the chat throughout. We'll have a time of Q&A at the end, and we'd like for this to be an informal discussion. So during the Q&A, you'd rather voice your question or comment out loud, you can just raise your hand and we'll ask you to unmute. And the event is being recorded and streamed to YouTube Live. So the video will be available after the event for you to share or watch again. And that being said, well, we would love for everyone to have their cameras turned on and engaged in the discussion. If you prefer not to be recorded, you're of course welcome to keep your camera turned off. And just a few announcements about what we have going on at Taller. The current gallery exhibition is Un Viaje Entre by Gabriel Martinez. And it is a phenomenal exhibition. I would highly recommend stopping by to see it if you have not already. It will be on view until April 9th. And the closing reception for the exhibition will be on Friday, April 1st. That is free and open to the public. And then an exciting announcement starting on April 2nd, it's a Saturday, our gift shop will be open every Saturday for the spring and summer. Yeah, so hopefully more of you will have the opportunity to stop by. At this time, I am happy to introduce our guest for today. Marilisa Jiménez García is an associate professor of English and Latinx studies at Lehigh University. She is also the founding director and principal investigator at the Institute of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. Jiménez García's research on Latinx literature and education has appeared in Latino Studies, Centro, a journal of Puerto Rican studies, The Lion and the Unicorn, and children's literature. Her new book, Side by Side, U.S. Empire, Puerto Rico, and the Roots of American Youth Literature and Culture, examines the history of colonialism in Puerto Rico through an analysis of youth literature and culture, both in the archipelago and the diaspora. Jiménez García has worked on projects with Teaching for Change, the Children's Defense Fund, and Sesame Street. So now I'd like to hand it over to Marilisa.
Gracias, Lisa. Thank you so much. And just thank you for inviting me into this space. I'm already like really feeling the room and I see some familiar names also and colegas here. So thank you for being here and thank you for taking your Saturday and like saying you wanted to like come chat about children's literature. So I'm excited about that. I'm sure you can see my background behind me. Maybe some of you recognize it as a room in the Taller Puertorriqueño. So I'm trying to show some solidarity with you all. This was a picture I took when I was there once a while ago. And I wish we could all be together in person, but we're not. But here we are anyway. I'm looking forward to the conversation. So as Lisa said, I am Dr. Marilisa Jiménez García, and I'm going to talk to you today about my book, Side by Side. So let me share my screen so that I can start to chat with you a little bit more specifically about the book. Let me see if I can. Okay. Como siempre se va al principio. Can everybody see this? Yes? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I wanted to title this presentation specifically Side by Side, Puerto Rican Children's Literature as a Window Mirror into Puerto Rican Studies, Latino Studies, because I'm a professor of Latino Studies. I'm also a professor of children's literature. And so I like to study children's literature as a way of understanding what our history has been, what our conflicts have been. You know, I really see it as a vehicle for reflecting all of those things. And it's interesting because a lot of times we come to children's literature like, eso pa niño, right? Like it's for kids. But as we can see, especially today with so many battles over like what our young people should be reading, what should be in the curriculum and all these different things, I think part of what you'll start to see is like how entrenched our literature really has been, especially for our young people, how have we told our histories to them? And also, how have our histories been told to our young people and to other sort of more dominant young people in the United States? Like, who is Puerto Rico? What was Puerto Rico? How did the US get involved? And how our children's literature really reflects that history. And also children's media, because I'm going to talk about Sesame Street as well. So my first, slide is just a cover of the book and like 3 big ideas that I really wanted people to be able to carry away from this book. And one is Puerto Rico to the world, sort of like, I remember when I first started learning about Puerto Rico and wanting to study Puerto Rico in my doctorate, I had some people who were like, that's so limiting, like Puerto Rico is so small and it's very limiting. And I was like, listen, you don't understand. This little place is going to tell you everything about the rest of the world. And it's still doing that. And I'm so thankful to still see that in my work. And also Puerto Rico also has transnational conversation with the diaspora, right? And really not essentializing what that means. So beyond like the essential, the coquí, the el jíbaro, right? Like really thinking through like, what does it mean to be Puerto Rican and not making that an essential thing. Also, I wanted to make sure I highlighted like, what is the intellectual, aesthetic, pedagogical footprint and the way that we have produced our knowledge in Puerto Rico through text and performance. So one of the things I try to say with the book is that we have to go beyond books because a lot of our folks really believed in the oral tradition, storytelling, puppeteering, going on TV, all these different ways that we tell stories. It's beyond the text, but it's the text and performance together. And also one big thing I wanted to say was because a lot of our communities of color have been left out traditionally of the history of children's literature, right? Alice in Wonderland and like all these different things that we kind of associate with children's literature. I really wanted to center BIPOC, right, scholars, librarians, and artists in terms of they were there from the beginning of children's and literature industry in this country. In 1920s, Pura Belpre is already on the scene and she is already part of what becomes children's literature as a publishing industry and a librarian. What does like children's librarianship mean? She's in that conversation. So really trying to also undo this idea that we weren't there somehow, right? Like revealing these hidden figures. Okay, so this this picture, if you don't know who these people are, I think some of you probably do, but I just love to use this picture of what I mean by side by side, because I called the book Side by Side, but it's sort of like that awkward tension between the United States and Puerto Rico and like these running histories together. And what does it mean to grow up in the shadow of the US empire, right? So this is Rosselló, former Governor Rosselló, and former President Trump. And this is a picture of when they were talking about Huracán Maria and some of the aid and all the different conversations that were going on there. And there's George Washington overlooking the conversation. And so what I mean by side is, sometimes we use that term like as a friendly thing, right? Like friendship, like estamos juntos, like we're together side by side. But I really also wanted to say like, sometimes those who are closest are actually the most in tension, if that makes sense. Like how sometimes we get hidden in plain sight. And even in history and just the ways that some of this friendliness is kind of a mask also for erasing, really a lot of the difficulty and colonial struggle that has occurred with our community. So as I was saying, I study Puerto Rico through youth literature and culture. And these are just 4 frames I wanted to use also to think about moments in the book that I talk about. So if you do read the book, you'll see some of these are kind of chapters really is where they take place. The first frame is actually from the summer of 2019. And it is a picture of Laura Rihach Olivencia and her book, Por ahí viene el huracán, which is a picture book about Huracán Maria. And they're standing in a protest. Okay, so you can see that the author has like a gas mask around her neck. And what they're doing is basically getting ready to read the picture book during a protest in front of La Fortaleza and during the protest for the situation that happened with Governor Rosselló and corruption, right? Like all the stories we heard about the chat. And he was our first governor that resigned, right? And this happened because of the movement of people that really demanded that resignation. So thinking about like, interestingly enough, look at one of the ways that people protested, reading a picture book, right? Reading it out loud in front of La Fortaleza. So the ways that children's literature shows up in our movements as current as this particular moment. And I have next to that, I have a still of Pura Belpre. who I talk about in the book and I'll talk about a little bit later. But she was our first Latina librarian, storyteller, the person who founded bilingual librarianship in the New York Public Library. She was a storyteller, a writer. A lot of her books are still out of print. But thinking about this beautiful Black Boricua woman walking around in Spanish Harlem, and why don't enough people know about her? And also like the fact that she chose to do her work through children's literature, right? Like she thought that was the place she could contribute the most to. And you know, as far back as the 1920s, her career goes from 1920 to like 1980. Like she basically did the whole like 20th century. So really trying to lift up her portrait is part of my work. And then we have at the bottom, Nuyorican aesthetics of the novel. I don't know how many of you know that the first Latina novel in the United States in 1973 was written by Nicolás Amor. And it's from the perspective of a child. And it's, you know, some of us still think of it as a young adult novel, but it was actually like the first novel by a Latina in the US. And thinking again, you know, the use of this idea of childhood and writing for young people to tell that story. The first novel we have from a Puerto Rican woman in the United States, and like what it meant for her to use that as a way of telling her story. And Nicolás Amor is still alive, and I got to actually meet her during the process of this work, and I got to interview her. So I talk about that in my book. And then I think a lot of people probably know who the last person is Sonia Manzano and Sesame Street. And right, like how amazing is the fact that this, for 40 years on Sesame Street, we had this very prominent Puerto Rican woman who was not only a performer, but at one point becomes a writer for the show. So she's writing scripts and she's changing how Sesame Street really represents Latinos and specifically Puerto Ricans. I don't know how many of you also knew that Puerto Rican children and Black children were used as tests for Sesame Street when Sesame Street was being developed, that a lot of the communities that they were really thinking about reaching through television, Puerto Rican children were in that, and seeing that, you know, this whole idea of us being at risk and, you know, on the edge of sort of like the metropolis. So thinking about Puerto Rican history, right, like how it shows up in all these really prominent places and these different kind of moments. This is something I used to talk about, kind of like the children's literature industry as a whole, but like in the work that I was doing when I first started my research, and thinking through also the fact that I was going to talk about US empire, which makes a lot of people uncomfortable, right? It really disrupts a lot of ideas that we have about the US. But some of the questions and points that I make in the book, thinking about like how often writers and youth of color are left out of the concept of America, right? In terms of books often associated with the traditions of American children's and young adult literature, how the imaginative landscape of youth literature and children's literature scholarship was populated by predominantly white protagonists. Therefore, youth of color were seen rarely as active agents in their stories. And I think that's really why I love the Nicolás Amor story, because she writes the first Puerto Rican protagonist, you know, not just an animalito, not just an allegory, but like a protagonist who's, you know, acting out her story. Number three, how the population on the pages of American children's literature, even in the realm of the fantastical world, differed greatly from the lived experiences of American youth, even in terms of other youth media, such as television. And I also think about like why television sometimes is representing our community more than literature. Like what have some of those gaps been in literature? Why has it been so difficult to get on the page, you know, on a book, but maybe not in these other kinds of media? Number four, the absence of youth and writers of color affected how scholars spoke about youth and youth literature and culture. And this is like from my own career when I first started studying children's literature, where I would talk about like Puerto Rican children, and people were like, yes, but what does that have to do with children's literature? And it doesn't happen to me. It doesn't happen to me anymore. But I think even recently with our conversations about Black Lives Matter, and, you know, like the idea of how our young people get left out of what is a child, like, right? What is innocence? Who belongs in those stories? So I had to think about that quite a bit. Also, how scholars have been affected by that. And how children's and young adult literature tended to further the US as a nation of immigrants rather than a settler colony. into the 20th century, like how does the US even describe its relationship with colonies? Does it even tell stories to its young people that, hey, we still have colonies, right? Today, not just in the past. So thinking through some of these ideas is what I do also in the book. So this is a picture from one of the books that I look at, which is like in the early part of the book. This is from 1899, and it's a book that was published in the US for American children, for US white readers. And you can tell, you know, sort of like this exotic colonial gaze, right, that it has about like who Puerto Ricans are, what Puerto Ricans, or what the US was doing in Puerto Rico to sort of save Puerto Ricans from themselves. And even thinking about some of these stereotypes, how far back they go, you know, how Puerto Ricans are depicted as helpless and just like needing all of this, like really willless. I look into that and think about like, what does that have to do today when we still hear these kinds of things about our communities, that young people so far back have been hearing about us this way. Part of the challenges of working on Latino children's literature, so not just Latino literature, but Latino children's literature, was also in a lot of the work I've done is make the case for this as literature, like not like baby literature. Does that make sense? Because a lot of the writers, even the women writers especially, who have worked for young people's literature often get seen as like, not as artists, you know, not as doing the deep work that some of the other folks who are writing for adults do. So I've had to sort of really counter a lot of that through the work I do. And I think, thankfully, I think we're at a moment where I don't think I have to make that case anymore, but I certainly had to earlier in my career. And I think we still have some issues with people understanding like the quality of children's literature as art, rather than it's just like this fun thing, a cute thing. Does that make sense? So those are some challenges that I've had to deal with. And looking at some more of the figures in the book also, that I look at, like Arturo Schomburg and Pura Belpre together, actually put them together in a story or a chapter, knowing that they were contemporaries. Schomburg was actually one of the people who told Pura, like, you need to write your stories down, you know? So thinking about those two in conversation. And I do look at them also in terms of their embodiment, right? Two Black Boricuas, and thinking through also like how our history as Puerto Ricans in the US is founded on Blackness and founded on Black knowledge, you know, our Afro-Boricua knowledges, and how important that has been also to understanding our literacies, and really recovering that. Even as we have gotten sort of further on, there tends to be a really light-skinned version that we put out there, but how our foundation is really, you know, an Afro-Boricua foundation. And his work in archives and collections, her work in storytelling, and also like puppeteering, librarianship, right? Interestingly enough, both of them see children's literature and youth literature and librarianship as like the space to intervene when they first begin the community in Spanish Harlem and also in West Harlem. So I just think that that's also a product of like Black knowledge and understanding like the idea of history and literacy together, and that we need to credit it as such. And I do talk about Schomburg, the man who built a library, and the Storyteller's Candle as well, to talk about that. It's a moment to think about also in terms of reclaiming our Blackness in children's literature and our Blackness in youth literature. Thinking about how Belpre, and you see her face on the medal there for the Pura Belpre Award, how she is like this very prominent Black Boricua, but actually the first time a Black woman writer wins for the Belpre Award, it's in 2019 with Elizabeth Acevedo's The Poet X. So I think about also like, why don't we talk about her Blackness? Like, why do we remember her sort of in a Latina way? Like, why does it have to mean sort of like getting rid of her Blackness, right? Why is there that tension? And why has it been so hard for Black Boricuas, Black Dominicans to really be prominent in our literature and to win these awards? So I think through those issues, and I love this book also. She's not Puerto Rican, but hey, you know, I love it. My Dominican friends, man, we gotta stay in that. So I thinking through, this is an image of Miles Morales, but just want to say like what gets seen is Latinx. And I think that's also something that I have to think about as well. Often Latinx literature has really meant very light-skinned children. And so like why it's so exciting to now see this reclaiming of Blackness in our traditions as well, as I said before. So I want to think about also for a little while, one of the chapters is on Sesame Street and Sonia Manzano specifically, but I wanted to take the opportunity to include Emilio Delgado here. He just passed away recently, actually like what, 2 days ago recently. But thinking about Luis and Maria together is something I do, and like how important that image was, that bilingual image also was, for thinking through like Latinidad and like Latinos in TV. Well, some of the first Latinos on TV were on Sesame Street. And it's interesting because Maria, in a very Puerto Rican way, is sort of like this, she's kind of seen as like this romantic, bilingual, kind of truce. She kind of brings everyone together and connects everyone together. She's also very problematically the fix-it person on the show. So she fixes people's problems and literally works in a fix-it shop, okay, on Sesame Street. But I just find it really interesting to think through like how it reflects our Boricua, Chicano, bilingual movements, and how this image of this couple really changed a lot of the ways that we see Latinos and countered a lot of stereotypes. And Maria also on the show is one of the, she's the only person who plays also a mime. She specifically plays Charlie Chaplin throughout many parts of Sesame Street, the old Sesame Street. And so thinking through also like how is Maria seen as uniquely gifted with language? And also going back to the idea that Puerto Ricans are kind of like these intercessors, these people who are going to build a bridge, between the US and Latin America, which is an old colonial trope from that we're still kind of relying on. This is some just current children's literature from Puerto Rico. So I think you've heard me saying this throughout the presentation, but like, Boricuas are people that are sort of like hidden in plain sight. And why is that, right? Like when we talk about Puerto Rico, we're talking about disrupting the idea of the US as a settler colony, which is not something a lot of people want to talk about, especially not with their children. If we look at like the current CRT debates and all this stuff, right? It can be really difficult to understand that Latinos are harvest of empire, as Juan Gonzalez says in his book from 2000. We're still dealing with a lot of American exceptionalism, right? In terms of how we deal with history for young people. So this idea of like the US as a benevolent conqueror, we don't like to talk about colonization, and especially not contemporary colonization. And even specifically like land occupation, right? Like when we're thinking about Puerto Rico, we're thinking about land occupation. We're thinking about the US extending its borders and going into border crossing, as opposed to, hey, everybody came here looking for a better life. Also, as you heard me say in the past, right, the racial paradigm and the conflicts with race because of our ideas about mestizaje, like Black Boricuas, light-skinned Boricuas, people have a tendency to not really want to see us in that complexity. So that kind of black-white binary is really difficult for people to see beyond. Also the ways that race and language interplay in our community, right? Because that's also, language has also been used to discriminate against our community in a way that a lot of folks don't tend to see. We have legacies of criminalization. Also, like when you think about, why don't I hear more about Boricua history, or why don't I hear more about Boricua literature? I mean, there's like policies that made it almost impossible for our community to be able to do those things, right? So like actual policies that have banned the teaching of ethnic studies, for example, even in our own Puerto Rico, where our histories are censored in the public school system. And there's a lot of that I talk about also in terms of women writers working under censorship, right? Because they weren't allowed to talk about certain groups and certain leaders. So how have Boricua and other Latinxes been regulated as anti-American for young readers? And like I said, Chicano and Puerto Rican histories represent the US as border crosser, right? So that's a really difficult thing sometimes for people to talk about. And this is just something I wanted to end on, welcoming questions about this, but this is something I struggle with myself. As much as children's literature can be a window for us to look into, right, and to look at other communities, it's also a mirror, and the mirror reflects great things about us, and it can be a beautiful thing, but we also need to be critical of our own community, right? And critical of the fact that we're still dealing with a lot of our own anti-Blackness and upholding of white supremacy and whiteness in our own authorship and in our ways of representing our community. So going beyond celebration is something I'm hoping we can do as a community of authors, that we're not just like super excited about every book that comes out, that we really need to be critical about like what we're passing on in terms of our culture, because there's a lot of sexism, a lot of racism also that is part of community history, and what the publishing industry definitely has kind of marketed as Latino, and what it has to do with also like proper Spanish, right? A lot of our Caribbean Spanishes were not seen as like proper Spanish. If you go back to Belpré, there's a recording of her reading one of her famous stories, and they actually made her speak with like a proper Spanish accent at the time. So it's kind of like thinking through also like getting beyond these, right, these colonial tropes, and really representing our community in a way that our young people are not seeing themselves in some kind of deficit, right? So that's something I'm hoping we can move toward and think about, especially through this kind of research. Let me see. I don't think I have another slide. Yeah, I don't have another slide. So that's how I'm ending. So I'm opening up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation.
Can you show the picture of the Puerto Rican literature that you have in your, because you went through it really fast and I couldn't see it.
Which one?
The one about la literatura de Puerto Rico.
Yes. Okay. Okay, I can. It is really fast, and it's like
That one.
Not even comprehensive. If you're interested, and I can drop this in the chat later on, I do have a longer list, and I think Jean Marie is also here. I saw Jean Marie Lugo's name here. And she's definitely like a specialist in contemporary children's literature in Puerto Rico. But like my first chapter and my last chapter really talk about like the contemporary authors that are out there, like Tere Marichal, Wanda de Jesus, Georgina Lázaro, you know, and we don't hear about them, right? It's so difficult for us to get these kind of titles. So, and I think there's also like a real problem with that when we think about like, what about Puerto Rican literature, like literally being written in Puerto Rico, right? For young people, like the publishers are not supporting that community, right? And there's a whole history of also like the presses in Puerto Rico being shut down and just all these things. But if you're interested, I can drop it in the chat. I actually have a list that I can give y'all with more of the titles and also how to get them from an actual like Puerto Rican children's bookstore in Puerto Rico que se llama Aparicio Distributors. So if that helps you. Okay. Okay.
All right, well, while you all are typing your questions, if you have any, Marilisa, do you want to talk a bit about the process of putting this book together?
Yeah, thank you. I think you heard me also kind of little throwing shade here and there about like when I first started to like as a grad student. And I was told, no, write about that. That's going to limit your career, you know, and it's just so interesting to hear that when I feel like it's like limitless at this point, like what I could talk about if it comes to Puerto Rican studies. So a lot of that I think was part of also like why I wrote the way that I did. So I'm looking forward to the next book, not having to think through some of those things because ya hicimos eso, no hay que decir lo mismo. But I think one of the things I can definitely say about the process, I was writing this like 2017 to 2019. So you can think about some historical events that also happened at that time, right? 2017 was Huracán María, Huracán Irma, and everything was closed in Puerto Rico, like all the libraries, you know, habían huelgas estudiantiles, right? The student strikes. And so my own access to my own history was literally blocked by what I could see was government, failure, both on the Puerto Rican side and the US side. And it was really also difficult to go to places like La Biblioteca Nacional, for example, that I had heard so much about from my mom and that kind of thing. And like getting there and people being like, yeah, no, everybody got fired. We don't have any librarians, and just that really stayed with me. And I also kept thinking, I'm like, yo vine aquí a hablar de algo, but now I'm gonna have to talk about something else here because how can I ignore this? So I do try to bring some of that, like not just that I'm there to read some of these books, but like what's going on around these books and like why we have such a lack of access. And so those were really interesting moments. Also, the Ricky Renuncia happened. And I was like, there goes my introduction. We're gonna have to rewrite this. So the introduction was written so many times because of like, every time I would start, it was like, otra cosa pasó. And I think also, if I were to do this again, it'd be the same thing. Cause I know that, if we look at our history, right, it's just, our current community and what it's going through in Puerto Rico is there's always something happening that I feel there's a burden to talk about. So that can be a real challenge for someone who's writing a book at the time. But those were definitely some things for me.
Thank you. Joanna asks, how do you think this will change?
I don't know if you need a clarification. I realize I wrote that and it didn't have a lot of detail in the question. So I would say, so my question would be, something that you were talking about was a lot of the lack thereof, these resources. And I've been an educator here in the Latino community of Philadelphia for the past 23 years. And when I was still I'm just out of the classroom, but when I was in the classroom, I taught a bilingual, kindergarten. So books were my life. And of course, my mother, who's also here, is a librarian. So, I'm trying to amass books that are reflecting the experience of my students, right? And I need them in Spanish because I'm also teaching half the day in Spanish. And it was very, very, very difficult to get any relatable content for my students. It just so happened accidentally, before anybody knew who Guiara Alegría Hoods was, I got a book. It was part of a book thing that we had or whatever. It's called Welcome to My Neighborhood. So, and it was, Bienvenido a mi barrio. And my students, it was in English and Spanish, lit up. It was an ABC book. It's perfect for kindergarten. And it was written about kids in Kensington, which is where I was with my babies, and they're eating piraguas and the elves in the back. And just to see the way that they connected to this book, because I can read books about Puerto Rico to my babies, but they haven't been there. That's not their experience. It enriches them, of course, but it's not their experience. And to read a story that I was like, they were like, that looks like here. And I said, that is here. This story is your neighborhood. It was just so, but I had to teach for almost, 20 years before I found that.
Before you got it. Yeah.
And so my question to you is, what do you think? How do you think that this changes? How do you think that, what needs to be done in publishing, in the community, in us raising and educating young people, that we get them to say, I'm going to write about my experience?
Yeah. That's a great question, but and I think you're right to point out, and I'm glad you said community, you said family, you said the school, because I think it's a system, and it takes all of these places and it takes support. And if I may, I think Taller Puertorriqueño is amazing for this, because I've had students in my classes who are graduate students who are like, when the school wasn't teaching about us, we went to Taller Puertorriqueño and we got what we needed. Do you know what I mean? So the importance of these spaces that need to be in the community so that we can also have our education. And I think something I learned too also through the book is how often a lot of the folks that I look up to as writers were all about that. you can't depend on these systems. These systems are not going to do this for you. We need to have our own ways of doing this. And, you know, be critical of the books, even like the ways that Belpré, I think especially, is really interesting for this as a storyteller, where she treated books almost like a script. Like, we're going to read this, but lo vamos a cerrar también, and I'm going to tell you another story, you know? And I just think that's so interesting to also develop that critical consciousness in young people that early when they're telling a story. And hey, I can make up a story too, you know, or this book is interesting, but I can make up a story. I can also tell a story. I don't have to wait for it to be a book in order for it to be a story. Does that make sense? So making that critical consciousness too, so that young people are asking those questions. And I think our people have been brilliant and resilient at that as AF. I know that's not like a proper academic term, but heck yeah. And I think also, like, to go back to the Kensington thing, I'm a New York Miami Rican. So like I've been brainwashed to a certain extent with the New York Rican experience, right? Like that's the utmost, like nosotros somos todo, like we're the same, you know, we're the best thing ever. But one of the things I've learned as a Miami Rican too, most of my life, there were no books about Miami Ricans, you know, and it's like when we expect kids to see themselves in our experience or whatever that experience was. And I think that's where we have to be critical. Like, we can't just have like that will be the only place where the stories are coming from. So publishers really need to be aware of these different diasporas, right? And these different communities that have a rich history. And Philadelphia, Lehigh Valley, you know, Pennsylvania is the second most place where Puerto Ricans are going after Florida right now. Florida has 1 million Puerto Ricans. Like, do you imagine the kind of stories, the kind of young adult novels we should be getting about little girls growing up in Orlando, little girls growing up in Miami? So I'm going to say girls, obviously. But, you know, I think that's also our own work in not time capsuling our histories for our young people. Like, it's got to be what I grew up with. And this is Puerto Rican, adobo and la cotorra, and like these really iconic things that we think it's got to be a coquí. I love my coquí books, but how many coquí books have we seen in our lives? Okay. How many Roberto Clemente books have we seen in our lives? Like, I love Roberto Clemente, but he wasn't the only person who had a history, right? So we also have to be critical and push against that, I think, and really demand for our rich history to be told from these different perspectives. And it takes a lot of different people to do that. And I think, you know, the school, the family, it's a system that is really difficult sometimes to get through, but that's my kind of way of answering it. And I think that Tayel is doing that work currently.
Thank
I do
you.
want to give a shout out. I did notice that Meg Medina was here. And so in talking about books that
Oh,
I
yes.
used, the Con mi abuela, the mango story, I did read that story. And when my daughter who's now about to turn 18, when she was about 13, 14, I don't know, somewhere in the beginning of high school, she was just desperate. She wasn't interested in reading Nilda or Felita or Coming Home, which were my go-tos, because it was just something that she just wasn't necessarily connecting with. And I could not get a copy, not anywhere. And I don't know where mine are. But anyway, we went to Barnes and Noble and we felt very defeated that we could not find hardly any books that had any by any Latino authors. Anyway, we found Jackie Delgado Wants to Kick Your Ass. And she was like so happy, and just that she found this story, and it wasn't necessarily her experience, but it was something that she connected with. And so I just wanted to give a shout out that I see that Meg Medina is here, and it made my daughter so happy to find that book. So.
Yeah, if I may too, like Meg is here. I don't know if she's gonna turn her camera on, but her, oh
my hair's a mess.
my God.
Estoy escondida, perdónenme todas.
I love her. But I remember meeting Meg the first time in like NCTE or something like that. And it's a weird moment that we both had where I wrote an article about Pura Belpré that Meg read. And I remember her saying, like, I am so thankful for this article. Like, I needed to read this article. You know what I mean? For her as an author to say that just meant so much to me. But it made me think of, like, this is why we need the authors, we need the scholars, we need the teachers, we need, like, all of us to learn to recuperate these things, because there's a reason we don't know these things. You know, nobody wants to really know about some of these things. And when we know, we get empowered in a way. You know, I didn't read my first book by a Puerto Rican author till I was in graduate school. That's messed up. You know what I mean? And look how excited I am. And we think about also like, if our kids get representation, they'll be transformed. Yo, if our 30-year-olds get representation, they will be transformed. We can be transformed at any moment in our career, I'm convinced. Once we really start to see like, we have this, like, why didn't I know? And like, now that I know, other people need to know. You know what I mean? But I'm gonna let somebody else.
Well, we have a question from Meg in the chat. It says, Marilisa, can you speak a little bit about Pura Belpre's use of puppets and non-book items as a means of literacy and as response to what you refer to as colonial violence? I think you called it decolonized Renaissance in the book.
Ooh, hardcore. She read though. Yeah. I think what I was seeing with the puppets and the theater part too, because she wrote these plays that she would have that were sometimes a little different from the stories that she told. So I think it's also interesting to see like how she revised some of these things for different moments and also for different audiences in Spanish and English. But what I could see the puppets perhaps doing in items, and also like the acting out, that young people could actually act out some of these events, is the empowerment that comes from like standing in a space where you're surrounded as a colonial subject, but you are a king or a queen all of a sudden in this story, and you're acting it out, you know, very close to the community that you're actually being discriminated against in. And then also, I think, you know, there's a lot to say also about the way that we don't have a copy maybe of all the things that she told young people, right? And the ways that she was a revolutionary and also was pushing against, you know, a lot of these tropes about Puerto Ricans don't have a history, which we know kids at the time in New York City were being told, literally. There are curriculums that I found that were like horrible, like from that time, that were just straight up, that was the curriculum. And I'm sure if I went to Philadelphia and did some digging, I probably find very similar kind of tropes. But when you think about how that kind of enacting of, you know, I'm a young person, I'm a Boricua young person, I have talent, I can act this out also in my embodiment, and in, you know, these sort of like extra literary ways. I think it teaches resistance. I think it teaches, you know, regardless of what's being said out there, I know who I am, and I can still participate in empowerment in ways that might evade some of this policing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much. Does anyone else have any questions, either in the chat or if you want to just unmute and ask it? Charlotte, you can go ahead.
No, I went through a phase where I have special needs kids. So I wanted to teach them Spanish because a little bit late in life, because of the disability, I wasn't sure if it was a good idea to teach them Spanish since they were little. But I did. I taught them how to read and write and all that. They're not fluent, but I went to Barnes and Nobles, yes, and Amazon to look for books in bilingual books of all ages, because when you have special needs kids, you can show them a baby book and they get excited about that. You know what I mean? Even if it's, and I love illustrated books, but I think that it is true as Hispanics mom, I feel like we should show this legacy to them, leave them with a legacy of Puerto Rico, because I feel like we lose our identity when we get here, because all we learn is white history. And then we lose our identity and then we don't know anything about our culture. It's like we're lost. All we will start learning is, you know, everybody else's history but ours. And I remember when my kids going through school, they learned about Roberto Clemente, but I was so disappointed. I'm like, there's so many great history out there about different Puerto Ricans and what they've done. And only they show Roberto Clemente. That's it. All throughout my son's school life, because they're now graduated now, all I've ever heard was Roberto Clemente. It's like our Puerto Rican history is never shown, and we are enriched in such a beautiful culture and different things. And it's true, we need more writers. We need to, as parents, give this legacy to our children so they can, so it stays alive in the minds of our children and children's children. It's true.
I was gonna say absolutely. And I think also why children's literature and works for young people is really like where my heart is, you know, where I dedicated my time to, because I do think that that kind of reading is a kind of space for recovery in many ways. And there's such potential in that. But I also see how it's really like, I hope you're seeing that through to also like there's a dominant culture knows that too, right? So like why the curriculum is the way it is, why at such a young age you're already being told you don't have a history, so don't worry about it, you don't need to learn it. So, you know, we really do need to be active in pushing against that. But thank you for saying that, Charlotte. I think it's Magna.
Magna. I was the one librarian, the bilingual librarian of Philadelphia forever. And it was interesting because when I went to Puerto Rico when I was 13 and then came back at 25 when I got married and came here, was fortunate to get a master's degree free of charge from Temple and Rutgers, but to do bilingual reference resources. And so, you know, I did work with the Free Library, and we used to go to New York to buy all the books in Spanish to bring so that the Free Library could start the collection. But then I jumped into the school district. And what I did was I worked mostly in the high school. In fact, I started out at South Philly. I was the 1% Hispanic in the school, no kids or anything. So it was really interesting. And I took advantage of that. And I prepared a curriculum with sixth graders on walking my shoes, where I would tell them all about Puerto Rico because they knew nothing about it since I was the only Hispanic they had ever encountered. After that, I did go and work at 3 different high schools where there were the population of Latino kids. And as usual, you know, they would always tap, you know, do you have any Spanish books? Do you have any, you know, bilingual books? And my daughter can tell you, Joanna, which many of the books she has were mine, that the collection kept growing and growing. And I searched everywhere. I would go to this publisher and I would go looking for what you're saying now is slowly, I see now that you can find them. But back then, you know, it was like I provided the school district kind of like a makeshift, book reviews of Latino books, which were not very many. Through the years, I was able to add on to my collection, and I did book reviews apart from the school district and was able to bring in, but you know, once they closed the schools in the Philadelphia, it was one of those things where I really could not believe they had just done that, because I was doing storytelling.
The libraries, Mom. You said they closed the schools, the libraries. They closed all the libraries and push librarians out of the libraries.
All of us. And it was the most incredible thing I could ever imagine, because, you know, my library was always packed. It was bilingual kids who wanted books in English, who wanted books in Spanish, and I was able to provide them, sometimes putting my hand in my pocket to be able to get those books. So I could not believe that a school district would do something like that. I've been retired now, I guess 9 years, but, you know, always interested, always participating in diversity committees and trying to get the word out there that, hey, we're here to stay, and we look different from one side to the other side, and I'm somewhere in the middle. So, you know, it's
Mom, you forgot to say that with your students, you published 2 books.
We did. And as it turns out, the 2 books that we published wasn't just about Latinos. It was about kids who from the Arab nation, white kids, Black kids, you know, they all participated. You know, we provided a lot of, you know, many of the librarians provided a lot of things for the kids. And, you know, the fact that they eliminated was really a sin against all children. But, you know, they're trying to open again, because I'm also constantly getting emails from students who are studying to be librarians. So they'll contact me and say, how can we do? What is going on? How? And, you know, that's the only way I can do now, is really as a retired person to just give feedback so that maybe we can get back on track, not just for English, but for every other language too. Because I know that, for example, Washington High School had the librarian who spoke Russian for the kids. You know, so that, to me, I thought that was progress. And then everything gets cut. Unbelievable. Thank you for listening.
Absolutely. No, I super appreciate what you're saying, because I think one of the things that is really interesting, especially about youth librarians, is the multiple roles that they play, right? And the ways that they are also like part of the training is, you know, being able to work with young people, and the educator aspect of it. It's so much more than, you know, this idea of like, well, they get us information. You know, although librarianship in general is a very, very complex thing. But I think, you know, one of the things that's interesting, because when I started writing this book, and even when I talk about it now, like I've had people be like, why do you talk about librarians so much? Like, you know, and even like the whole, like, we want to talk about literature, you know, and I'm like, I do too. And that's why we need to talk about librarians. And I will say too, like, especially for our communities of color, the source that librarianship has been for empowerment, in many ways, because these literary spaces have been very traditionally white spaces. Not to say that librarianship has not been as well, but it's amazing what librarianship has been for, you know, people like Augusta Baker, for example, like Pura Belpré, you know, that as women of color and women of color writers were able to use librarianship in these revolutionary ways and not see it as separate from the work that they were doing. So to me, it's like that we need to understand that when we're talking about children's literature, we're talking about librarianship, we're talking about those who are writing literature, and those who are educators, and those who are going to take these books into the classroom, or not be able to take these books into the classroom, right? And that I think Jean Marie is in here somewhere. I keep talking about Jean Marie, but she's a librarian at the University of Puerto Rico. And I actually also worked with her on other projects, especially Afro-Boricua children's literature. But when we look at the fact that Puerto Rico itself doesn't have a public library system.
No, it doesn't.
You know, and the Carnegie Library, the Biblioteca Nacional, all these different things, if you really look up what's going on with our public, what we had as public libraries, it's really devastating, you know, to understand, like, what does it mean when you have no libraries, and what you do have, what kind of archival history is being shut down. This is intentional, you know, and it's really devastating for our population. Some of the books, even like the textbooks that I study in the first chapter, these are books that were written for Puerto Rican children by Puerto Rican educators. They're being basically thrown out by the droves. You know, you can get them for free. And I actually saw piles of them as trash from all the schools that were closed in Puerto Rico, which we know also happened, right, in the crisis. This is literally, in my opinion, close to genocide. You know, it's like an intellectual, you know, genocide.
I do want to add that one of the most interesting things, because I did grow up in Catholic schools in New York City, New Yorican and all that. But it wasn't until I got to, you know, Puerto Rico, and I had the most wonderful storytellers as Spanish teachers. And it was so amazing. I thought to myself, oh my God, you know, we have history, because you're right. You know, in New York, there was nothing that said we were anyone except West Side Story. But It was amazing, because my first Spanish teacher in 7th grade, and mind you, I had just come from the United States, so my Spanish wasn't all that great. This woman, when she opened her mouth, I saw what she was talking about. The palm trees, the natives. Oh, I thought to myself, oh my God, this is the most exciting moment. It was I still remember her name, Mrs. Molinari, because she was the most exciting person to ever hear. And after that, you know, I was hooked. But you're right. Every school that I was studied in Calle, and the school library was manned by the Spanish teacher, which was okay, because Spanish teachers had it all. The English teachers were a little more, you know, that's how I got roped into being a bilingual teacher in Puerto Rico, which is where I started. But, you know, even when you went to the university, there were very few books that you could actually put your hands on. You had to go to the desk ask for it, look through the card catalog. It was amazing because I knew that in New York City, you could walk to any public library and pick up the book. So, you know, when they offered the master's degree in library science, it was a little more difficult because you don't get that kind of experience. But let me tell you, it was the most wonderful experience I've had. When they closed the libraries down, I thought, now what am I going to do now? Well, I'm still involved with looking for the books, always searching, you know, seeing, adding on to whatever we already have. And it's exciting now because I see it. I see that there's more people who are being encouraged to share. So thank you for all of that.
Thank you. Thank you. I was going to say, this is the first, I think, book about, you know, Puerto Rican children's literature that is, and some people have told me, no, there's a bibliography about it. And, you know, but I'm like, but this is the first analysis of even some of the actual books.
Yeah, I have it here.
Oh my gosh. My goodness. What is happening? What is happening? Okay. Oh, she's got the post-its. Yeah, that's intense. But I super appreciate it. And I just consider it a blessing. And I know this sounds crazy, but I really feel like this was like a God-given thing that I had to do and get out of my system. And so maybe next time we have another chat about a book, which I will have another book on ethnic studies and youth literature, which is an edited collection. But hopefully you don't have to restart this history over and over again, right? That it's like it's been done. Like, let's move on and let's start looking at these writers and really admiring from them from what they've done, and not just like rehashing the old history over and over again.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I wanted to add something that I think everybody will appreciate. So one of the schools that I work in, now I work with lots of different schools in the Latino community here in Philadelphia. I'm a teacher coach. And one of the buildings that I'm in is Luis Muñoz Marin. And they got their principal left and they got a new principal in, and she was repainting it. In the beginning of the year, I came in and I looked around. I said, what's going on? She said, oh, we're going to repaint the building. I mean, the room. She's not Latina. Okay. So previous, it was a Latino principal. So I look over and there's a beautiful mural that I've taken many pictures of Perez and Martina from Bedpre. It's a beautiful mural. Went from when the building was built in 1997, because it's a Latino school. It's it's like 95% Puerto Rican. So I said, you're not going to paint over the mural, right? And she looked at me and I said, you cannot paint over that mural. And she just, normally I'm really very nice. I'm usually very like jovial and funny. And she saw I was dead serious. You cannot paint. And she did not paint over it. She saved it. Thank the Lord. She saved that mural. It's so beautiful. So, I was like happy that I influenced her to not paint over the mural. However, there isn't a librarian in that library. It is used for other things, which, is very sad to me. However, yesterday, the one day that I wasn't at that school, President Biden and Secretary of Education Cardona showed up at Marin. They did a whole tour at Marin yesterday. And they were in the library, saw the pictures. All my friends that are, the teachers that I work with showed me pictures. And so it's just funny, ironic that we're having this meeting and we're talking about that people only know about like Clemente. And I'm thinking, I hope that people are seeing those headlines today and they're thinking, who the heck is Luis Muñoz Marin? Like, what is that school? And I hope that he looked up and that Cardona looked up and they saw that mural on that wall and maybe made a comment or that it just was like a nugget in their minds, like, oh, why is there a mural of that here in this building? So anyway, I wanted to share that. It was just like pretty awesome. And I hope that like little nuggets ended up in people's brains after that experience.
Wow. Yeah, I put my name or my email in the chat in case anyone wants to follow up with me about anything, really, because I just especially love hearing from educators who are working in the Philly area. I do work on education justice initiatives through the work I do at Lehigh. So that'd be amazing. I also wrote another book that's a curriculum on Puerto Rico. It's called Caribbean Connections. And you can find it through this link I gave you all with the bibliography. It's a free resource. It's a free book, basically, that you can download and use in your classroom. But thank you so much. And I would love to see that mural. I would love that. So let me know where it is. But thank you.
I'll send you the picture.
Yes, please do. Please do. I don't know if you all have to go now or what's going on, Lisa.
Yeah, we'll wrap up in a minute. I guess just for a last question, do you have any upcoming projects that you're working on that you'd like to talk about?
Yes. First of all, I just want to say, like, y'all are the best. I have not been to a book talk like this. I could be here all day. I love y'all. You're amazing. Philly in the house. I love it. That's just want to say that. But then, yes, absolutely. So working on an edited collection for SUNY Press, that's on ethnic studies and youth literature. So also looking at other communities of color in the struggle for representation in the curriculum, and different scholars that will be writing on that. So Indigenous, African-American, right, Latinx, and looking at all of our different US traditions. But definitely also hoping to go into writing or helping write a children's book. But we'll see. But that's definitely something I'm interested in. So those are some projects I'm excited about.
Cool. We'll be excited for when this come out. Thank you so much, Marilisa, for the presentation and this discussion, and thank you so much for everyone who came and participated. This was been a really great conversation, and I'm glad that it's all been recorded. So afterwards, I'll send out an email with a quick survey and with the link to the YouTube video if you'd like to share this discussion, and a link to purchase the book as well if you haven't already. And then I feel like this conversation is a great segue to announce our next Meet the Author event, which will be on April 9th with Raquel M. Ortiz. She has a new children's book out called Broken Butterfly Wings.
I know Raquel.
I don't know how many of you are familiar with her and with her books, but they're excellent bilingual children's books. We have all of them available in our store, with one more coming in stock the next week or so. So I'll include that. Actually, I'll put the link in the chat right now with more details and to register for that, and I'll include that in the email as well. Yes, that goes.
Marilisa, I have a question. Do you do things up at Lehigh for students, or like professional development? Or I'm just thinking about all of the teachers that I work with in these schools that service Latino students. I'm on the board of Taller, but I'm also in the Equity Coalition for the School District of Philadelphia. And it occurs to me that some of the things that are topics in your book would be really good professional development for teachers who are working with Puerto Rican students, and just Latino students in general, from the side of representation in literature and how teachers really influence the lives and the minds and the thoughts of children, in a deeper way.
Absolutely. So I'm trying to get the link now, but I actually have a series that I have been doing through the Institute on Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, where I put together, that's in the event. Some of the workshops are actually there, cataloged, so you can look at, but I definitely have put together a series on Latino studies in K through 12. And we, awesome. So with that in mind, especially because to connect the children's literature part of it, because I noticed that a lot of times we talk about Latino students and we talk about emotional learning and, trauma-informed care, but people are not talking about the curriculum and how that could be traumatizing our kids, to be honest. So also bringing those ideas together, and having an author or having a teacher also talk, and teachers that are navigating the systems, right? So because sometimes we bring teachers in who are just be as radical as possible, but a lot of them are in private schools and they get to do that, not our public school teachers. So we have done that in the past, and we certainly, I can certainly do that if you're interested in connecting about that. But I would definitely recommend going to that link, because we have some stuff that's up already that from last year especially, and it's something I continue to do through the work I'm also doing just outside the book, writing the books. But absolutely. Gracias, Joanna, right? Yeah.
Thank you again, everyone, for attending, and thank you so much to Marilisa. We hope to see you all Friday, April 1st for our closing reception, and then again on April 9th on Zoom for the next Meet the Author. Have a great rest of the weekend, everyone.
Thank you all. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.